Hey there, happy holidays, and nice to see you. Welcome to the Bronx Buzz. This is BronxNet's program where we talk to reporters, writers, editors, people who are putting stuff out, so you get a little insight into what they're thinking about when they write stuff in the borough of the Bronx. And in our second segment, we do music and arts. We're going to do jazz today, something real special. So right now, she's also very special. Our buddy Katie Honan, who is a reporter for the city and co-host of the FAC NYC podcast. Nice to see you again, Katie.
Thanks for having me on, Gary.
One thing which I really appreciated, I know it was a fundraising effort. I saw a little bio, a little statement from you that came into my email that gave us a little insight. And I'm just going to read from it. I don't want to
Thank you.
embarrass you. It said, I was a native New Yorker and a nosy one. I wanted to know about everything and everyone in this great city. Just before we get into a very specific, important issue, talk to me about your passion for doing what you do, for being a journalist.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that. We're a nonprofit and this is our fundraising month.
Yes.
And for me, I'm just a native New Yorker, just as it said, and I love New York City. It's really the only thing that interests me as a beat. I know that that's a very expansive beat, but it's really the only thing that's ever interested me in journalism. And that's kind of what led me to this industry and this path. I went to CUNY's Graduate School of Journalism. And I only ever wanted to cover New York. So I've thankfully, been very fortunate to have the opportunity to do that. Anything going on in the five boroughs is sort of my domain, I like to think. And that's what I love
There it
about the
is.
city. And it always changes, and the people are important to me. So that's what drives me.
What is, to me, extremely significant is the city itself, and I'm not talking about New York City, which we can see behind me, but I'm talking about the city. It's a wonderful publication. They're open to investigative things. You get the features. You get really a real flavor for who we are, and the way the stories are told, I think, are in the vernacular that we all use. I mean, you can really I read it religiously
Thank
and
you.
you digest it. And so anyway, congratulations on landing where you want to be.
Yeah, thank you.
Uh,
It's hard, but I appreciate the support.
I believe me, I understand it because I'm doing what I want to do also here in the borough of the Bronx. Anyway, you wrote this is such an important story. I'm going to read the headline: Council slams mayor for scapegoating migrants to justify the budget cuts. And I have to tell you, when I heard the mayor talking about this is off the journalism path, this is what I thought of when
Mhm.
I heard him talking about the level of budget cuts that he wanted to do, and he connected it to the migrant problem and said it's because of them. I was like, wow, that in my mind, I was doing the same thing the city council is saying. So, talk to me a little bit about this attitude toward migrants by Mayor Adams and how it relates to the budget and some of the most important personal things to us as New Yorkers.
Yeah, so what the city is facing right now is between June of this past year, when we passed this current fiscal year budget, and November of this year, a $7 billion budget gap. And because of that, there were across the board cuts at every city agency you could think of. Sunday library service at the three branches at some individual libraries, some Department of Sanitation initiatives, some composting initiatives. The Parks Department, I think this might be one of the more significant ones. It cut its job training program that really supplied 60 to 70% of the cleaning at city parks through this workforce, thousands of people who were put through this program and given
Yep,
jobs. And
absolutely.
Mayor Adams has been very vocal and very outspoken about the lack of support, mainly financially, from the federal government as the city has dealt with what's been over 100,000 asylum seekers coming to New York City. And obviously, New York City is a right to shelter city, although a lot of that has been kind of chipped away in recent weeks. But what we're dealing with is this influx of people, right? And the city, New York City, is not getting, to Mayor Adams' opinion, is not getting the financial support from the federal government.
Let me just add to that.
Yeah.
In a lot of people's opinions,
Yes.
the federal government, in particular the White House, his visits to Washington, D.C., Brad Lander was in Washington recently, and they didn't come back with the bacon. And, for a Democratic mayor and a Democratic president, it's interesting. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and the mayor has really squarely blamed these cuts that have been very painful to a lot of people, although at this point, no layoffs and no tax increases, although the mayor
Right.
has sort of threatened it. He's blamed it on the migrants. But what the city council pointed out was there were a lot of factors that went into this. A lot of it is the COVID era funding from the federal government expiring. A lot of it is tax revenue that is not coming in as much as it did before COVID. We've kind of had this domino effect of issues here in New York City, starting with COVID in 2020. And then obviously the asylum seekers, which put a strain on the city's budget. But to the council's defense, and a lot of other budget experts have said it's not the only reason.
Uh, so that's number one, and I'll quote from the testimony of the director of the city's IBO, the Independent Budget Office. IBO estimates a budget surplus this year and the budget deficit for 2025 to be smaller than OMB's estimate. And I did an interview with Council Member Eric Dinowitz recently, and he said, if we're a little more efficient about some of the things we do and really look, at cutting waste or duplication or things like that, maybe we could not have these cuts. And the mayor's, I just felt like, and this is from me, that he was using, that the migrant situation as a cudgel and to get people riled up about it. I didn't think it was very New York mayorish, to put it that way. That was my own read of it. And,
Yeah, and I think
put
he has been
commentary up there if you want.
no,
That's
and
fine.
he's been criticized for what is really creating this us versus them thing. If you're upset that maybe your child's public school had some cuts to it, or your summer rising program had some cuts to it, which was one of the realities of the November plans modification,
Right.
you know, you're going to blame the migrants. And even the mayor, he's suffered some low poll numbers recently. And his response has been, yeah, I'm angry too. So I think he ultimately wants the city as a whole, his constituents, to feel a real anger towards the federal government. And I think also what happens is, unfortunately, there might be some resentment growing for people who are, seeking political asylum and not exactly given the best, and they're not given luxury hotels to stay at. At this point, a lot of them are staying in tents, or they're not staying anywhere. So that's sort of the issue. And the mayor has criticized the federal government because he says this shouldn't be a city's problem; it's a federal problem.
Right, and throwing money at it is one thing, but you talked about the decisions that migrants themselves are making. Again, it needs a broader look. It's not the kind of problem like you say, well, the city has a garbage problem or a rat
Mm.
problem. We can, just kind of deal with it by being very specific. These are very complex issues. You can't just put up a space like an Orchard Beach that didn't work and you and do that. Then the other question is, which also came up in my interview with Council Member Dinowitz, is the notion of for-profit
Yeah.
versus non-for-profit providers. And many people are saying the for-profit providers may be easier to get to do some of the work, but they may be more expensive and costing all of us a little more money.
Yeah, and the city council and Comptroller Brad Lander have been very critical of Mayor Adams and his administration's decision to give a lot of money, almost cutting a blank check to these for-profit providers. They were given these contracts under an emergency contracting, so they didn't have the same level of oversight, which Comptroller Brad Lander has recently tried to limit a little bit of that. Obviously, if anyone's been reading the news or watching the news, the mayor and the comptroller have been at odds over the last year or so over many decisions. So I think this kind of was one more chapter in the Brad Lander, Eric Adams feud since they've both taken office. So this is sort of their fighting over that. The mayor has said, if you make it harder for us to do these emergency contracts, all it does is make it harder for us to take care of the asylum seekers.
You can't, and you're a sophisticated reporter, you can't look
Okay.
at that relationship. That's okay. You can't look at that relationship and not think that Mayor Adams is looking down the road and saying, well, assessing the field of potential competitors for his mayoral election, and not identify Brad Lander. And it doesn't help on the other side that Brad Lander is trying to rope the mayor in and do some, but that is the job of the controller, like it or
Yeah.
not. Your colleague Gwen Hogan wrote a story about the right to shelter
Mhm.
that no longer exists for thousands of migrants. This also adds to the problem. And that, of course, was a Mayor Adams decision, right?
Yeah, my colleague
You
Wynn
know,
wrote
as I'm trying to balance this thing
it's
and say, well, okay, where are we at? And there's just so many elements that don't seem to be logical, you know?
yeah, it's a big, complicated city, and that's what the mayor always says, and he's not wrong.
Not
And
wrong
what my
about that.
colleague Gwynn said today, which you wrote, the day we're recording this, is that although we legally still have a right to shelter mandate, that is sort of being discussed in court. Um, Mayor Adams and his administration is trying to say that this shouldn't apply for this level of emergency.
Yeah.
But practically speaking, you don't have that anymore. And for women and children are getting housed, but for dozens of the people that she's spoken to, they're sleeping in bathrooms, they're sleeping on the floor of some waiting centers, although you legally can't sleep there. They are sleeping outside, even though Mayor Adams and his administration has denied that that's the case.
Well, we know that there's no question about it. You just got to look around the streets. Then, of course, what complicates that is the children in schools. And I know the Department of Education is working as hard as it can to incorporate the children in schools. I think there are seats for them. If you look at the numbers of seats
Mhm.
available in the city schools, but if you have a child who was in a shelter, let's say in Brooklyn, and now all of a sudden, the family has to relocate for one reason or another, and now they're in the Bronx. What are you going to do? Send them to school in the Bronx, or you're going to make them ride the subway and get to Brooklyn in some form? I mean, it just doesn't add up, and I think what it does is it really complicates the the whole scenario. And then the mayor says, well, let's just cut the budget. And I appreciate that you mentioned parks, because I think when you deal with police and fire and even composting and all the other stuff, the parks gets underserved, so to
Yeah, the
speak.
Parks Department, they've been fighting for years, advocates to have 1% of the city's budget. They haven't reached that. And I think a lot of the cuts, the mayor stresses public safety. And I think there's a lot of elements to public safety that go beyond police and fire, right? And one of those is having clean and safe recreation spaces that if they're threatened under budget cuts, then I think the people of
Yep.
New York City will be the first
No,
ones to really affects.
no question about it. And we also understand this mayor was a police detective. So, you know where he's coming from. Anyway, Katie Honan, reporter for the city, co host of the FAC NYC podcast. I don't know what we would do without you. We
Well, I
need you.
appreciate that. Thank you.
We need you to keep rolling up your sleeves and getting it done for the city. Please, folks, check out the city. Uh, if you have a mind to, make a donation, but at minimum, click on it, read it, and understand our beautiful city a little better because of people like Katie Honan.
Thanks so much. Have a great new year.
You too. Okay, we're going to take a short break, and then it's jazz. That's a 4-letter word. Yeah, jazz. We'll be right back.